This is yet another series where I barely played the games, so most of these were my first time through. This list is based on how fun the games are to me and how well they hold up. I'll be including the Diddy Kong Racing titles, but not the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, and that's because of these polls that I ran on this channel. But with that, grab yourself a banana and let's get her ranked. 34. Donkey Kong Jr. Game & Watch. While there's a few variants of the Game & Watch titles, I stuck with the original versions for this video. The goal of Donkey Kong Jr. is to free Donkey Kong by grabbing a key and swinging over to him. However, I didn't manage to do this because, well, just look at it. This barely counts as a video game as it is, and there's a bunch of birds and snapjaws that kept getting in the way. The controls are incredibly stiff, and it was really annoying having to wait for the enemies to get out of the way before I could head towards the key. I thought it was pretty awful, but I'll admit that these are charming little games for the 80s. 33. Donkey Kong 2 Game & Watch. This is kind of a sequel to Donkey Kong Jr., as the goal is the same: get a key to Donkey Kong to free him. The only difference is the layout is more complex, and you need to get 4 keys up top to free DK. The same problems are present here. The controls just suck, and jumping over enemies can be really annoying, seeing as they don't actually animate. It was slightly better just because of the more intricate layout, but that's all I can give this. 32. Donkey Kong Game & Watch. Technically, the first handheld game Nintendo ever released. It's the same concept as the arcade classic: climb the stairs and reach the top. This time, however, you have to pull a switch and time your jump to grab a crane to reach the top. You just repeat this over and over, and it's just fine. I really didn't like how limited your jumps are. These girders are in the way of your jumping range for like 50% of the screen, so that means you're really constrained with what you can do, and it requires a lot of waiting around until you can make progress. It was neat to try, but definitely not something I'd go back and play. 31. Donkey Kong 3 Game & Watch. An interesting take for this one. You play as Stanley and have to fill up a spray bottle. You'll then aim your spray bottle at bees to force them to sting Donkey Kong. The idea on its own is super bizarre, but it makes for an okay game. The controls are, again, kind of stiff, but at least it's more engaging and freeing than the other games I tried earlier. 30. Donkey Kong Jr. Math. There's one educational game in the franchise, and it's based on the original version of Donkey Kong Jr. All you're really doing here is basic math. Donkey Kong puts up a random number, and you have to grab the correct symbol and numbers to get the score. Not only does this barely qualify as educational, but climbing the vines is really awkward. It technically works, but sometimes you'll connect with a number and the game doesn't count it, so you have to move over it a couple times before it gets recognized. This is painfully unfun. It's only higher than some of the Game & Watch titles because the controls are more functional. 29. Donkey Kong Circus Game & Watch. This one is just weird. You control Donkey Kong that's balancing on a barrel, and you have to juggle pineapples without touching the flames. If you hit the flames or drop a pineapple, Mario starts laughing at you. It's so jarring to see this, considering Mario is the nicest motherfucker on the planet nowadays. The controls are actually responsive as well, and that alone makes it a bit more enjoyable than the others. 28. Donkey Kong Hockey Game & Watch. Another strange one. You're playing a game of hockey against the big monkey. You can move in 4 directions, which makes this the easiest game to control and play out of all the Game & Watch titles. I was honestly having a bit of fun with it, but the referee goes wild sometimes. He literally just shows up whenever he feels like it and changes the direction the puck is going in. I don't think I've ever played a hockey game where the ref is allowed to interfere with the game itself. 27. Donkey Kong Jr. Mario is having his revenge and has trapped the funny monkey, so you play as Donkey Kong Jr. to save him. And apparently, this version of DK that we're playing as is the current version of DK, so he's the only Mario character that canonically ages. As for the game itself, I didn't really care for it. The gameplay is very different to the original Donkey Kong, and I was not that big of a fan. The main idea is to climb these vines to use fruit to hit enemies, and reach the top to save DK. All 4 levels have unique ideas, which is nice, but the actual climbing mechanics are super confusing. If Junior is on one vine, then he moves up really slowly, but moves down really fast. But if he's on 2 vines, then moving up is slightly fast, and moving down is about the same speed. You can also jump from vine to vine, but it's kinda clunky. The simple fact that the speed that you climb the vines is so wonky and weird makes playing really cumbersome. I was forced to memorize these awkward speed changes, and I didn't find it to be very fun because of that. And you know what's really weird? The vine speed is consistent in Donkey Kong Jr. Math. Why are the controls better in the educational game? So, I don't know, man. DK Jr. is a cool premise, but I think simplicity works a lot better for an arcade game. They should have just kept the speeds all the same. 26. Donkey Kong 3. This is another strange game. You play as Stanley and have this spray bottle. You'll use that to attack a bunch of different enemies as well as Donkey Kong. You're also trying to protect your flowers at the bottom, and that's pretty much it. I like that it's a bit simpler, but this has really deviated a lot from what people liked about the original DK game. I can appreciate the smooth movement and being able to jump to different levels, but I just don't really care for this that much. These arcade games were made before Donkey Kong had any sort of established formula, so it makes sense why all three of these titles are so different. This one just doesn't have much charm to it. You're just hitting stuff with a bottle and it's not that enticing. 25. Donkey Kong. Nintendo's first huge hit in the arcades, and there are a ton of versions of this game. The one I played a lot as a kid was the Game Boy Advance version, and the NES one is fairly common as well. There's a total of 4 levels, although a lot of these versions only have 3. The levels are fairly unique and all have varied concepts amongst each other. You also have a catchy little jingle before the game starts, and the controls feel okay. Moving around is nice, but the jumps are locked in and can't be adjusted in the air, so that can make jumping over barrels a bit tricky as you have to be more prepared for how Mario is going to jump. The only method of attack is to grab a hammer, and this is effective to an extent. In a pinch it can be helpful, but you also can't jump or climb ladders while using it, so it doesn't help that much unless you're in the harder difficulties. The hitboxes also aren't perfect. You can die to a barrel while using the hammer. And also, Mario has the most fragile body on the planet. The man can't jump higher than like 2 feet without dying, so you have to make sure he doesn't jump that high. So for what it is, this is an okay game to try out once or twice, but it's really not worth playing beyond that. 24. Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. Hold up, a kart racer where you fly around in barrels and you can pick from a large variety of characters? Well, that sounds pretty awesome. They even managed to get Dixie and Tiny Kong in here. And look at all those Kremlings you can pick from. The idea is pretty similar to Mario Kart, with things like bananas replacing coins on the road. The difference with that is the bananas are accumulated to build up a charge meter, and you can use this charge to get a nice boost of speed. It's a great incentive to collect bananas compared to the coins in Mario Kart, which only make you go slightly faster. There's also barrels you can run through, which leads to alternate routes, or allow you to go faster. They're fun to spot and fly through. It's nice to see a big part of the DK franchise be integrated into a racing game so well. And of course, we've got items. These are very Mario Kart-esque and are objects or characters from the DK universe. Heck, Candy's Challenges is a bonus mode that's kind of like Mario Kart DS's mission mode. You'll complete a handful of specific challenges, and they're a pretty neat inclusion. Now, you might be thinking, why is this game so low on the list? Well, there's one problem. They completely f***ed up the controls. You want to know how to go right and left? You shake to go right and shake to go left. Why? What? There's a joke. This feels horrible to do! Not only is it tiring on your forearms, but simply making turns is difficult because the game only does turns in segments, and there's no real give to how quickly you'll move at once. You're literally locked into a grid system, which is really stupid for a kart racer. And every time you get hit, you slow down and have to shake the controllers to build speed again, which, guess what? That's kind of a big problem considering the fact that turning is with the same movement! And oh my god, Barrel Blast does everything in its power to slow you down. There's tons of obstacles all over the tracks, and while you can punch some of the barrels, not all barrels can be punched. So of course, you'd assume to just turn your character to avoid an obstacle. But no! Turning by shaking often takes too long and you'll just get hit, losing all the speed you built up. So what do you do as a plan B? You can jump in the air to safety, and that loses speed. So not only does jumping lose speed, but you also can't move around as easily in the air, so you have to hope that your committed jump doesn't lead you to getting hit by something anyway. What the hell happened here? I can't believe how much they messed this game up. Barrel Blast could have been a classic from the Wii library, but was instead destroyed because it just had to include the worst implementation for motion controls that I've ever seen in a racing game. Would it have killed them to not also offer the option to use the joystick? Or why not just have the motion controls be like a steering wheel? Mario Kart Wii has motion and stick controls, why can't Barrel Blast have both? This genuinely might be the most held-back Nintendo game of all time, all because the controls had to be different. 23. Donkey Kong Land. What a bizarre game we've got here. You might think that Donkey Kong Land is some downscaled version of Donkey Kong Country, but believe it or not, it's actually an entirely new game. It might not look very great, but this is Game Boy after all. They can only do so much. There's a good amount of levels to tackle, and while lots of themes are reused, some of them are brand new. You got these weird cloud levels, the skyscraper one, this construction site. I'm honestly shocked at how much effort was put into this game. Even the galleon ship from DKC2 makes a brief appearance. With that said, however, the levels don't stand out very well. The culprit behind that is just the lack of colors, and the music tone is always the same. Because every level is colored the same, they all start to blend with each other by the end. As for the new level themes, well, they're hit and misses. One of the ones I didn't really care for was the cloud levels. It was hard to tell where you could land sometimes, and these moving platforms were a pain in the butt. They move on their own and bounce off these grids, but you can also change the direction of the platforms by jumping on them. This leads you to being forced to do really precise jumps to move the platform to the correct direction. But the skyscraper levels were great. I especially love the one where you have to collect the Kong letters to make your own platforms. That's honestly a really fun idea that worked well. And for some reason, the hitboxes are very generous. Like, I kid you not, there were so many times where I'd be like a foot away from an enemy, and it would count as a hit. So while a bit janky, it made platforming a little bit easier, which is nice because the screen crunch is pretty tight. Although frankly, that's about the last positive I've got for Donkey Kong Land. The controls are okay and have this bit of floatiness to them. This made some jumps fairly easy, but you also sink fast when you begin falling, which make the big gaps tough. In fact, the floaty jump created one of the most annoying glitches I've ever seen in a platformer. There's times where you'll jump up really high and the screen moves up with you, but if you get too high up, the screen won't scroll back down and you will die once you reach the bottom of the screen. I have no idea how a glitch like this exists, but it was a problem for a good amount of the levels. The music is also forgettable. It's got a mix of remixes and original compositions, but really, it's just your typical Game Boy chiptunes, so you kind of have to like that style already to appreciate it. As for the bosses, well, they're all original ideas, but are way too easy. But holy crap, the first boss song goes hard. David Wise, Graham Norgate, y'all were cooking with that one. But oh my god, the ending was cracking me up. When you beat K. Rool, you get a blank white screen with some text scrolling up that says, "Congratulations." And then the credits roll. This has to be the best video game ending of all time. It's straight to the point, doesn't f*** around, and blatantly says that the game is over. While I wouldn't recommend playing this unless you're really curious, that ending is just perfect. 22. Donkey Kong Country Game Boy Color. So, funny story, this is the only Donkey Kong game that I owned as a kid. So going back to play it now was strangely nostalgic. Seeing all the menus, the unique title screens, the crunchy sprite work, it was a trip to relive this weird port. It's kind of amazing that this game runs at all. Squishing Donkey Kong Country down to Game Boy Color must have been one hell of a task. But they did it, and despite how impressive it is, it's really not worth playing. The controls are a little wonky, and for some reason your character is really heavy. You fall much faster than the original. It's kind of like Mega Man 1 actually. This makes the game way harder than the original, but that's not all. The collision is somehow even worse. There are so many times where I'd jump or get damaged by an enemy that I clearly hit, or I'd fall through a gap that I shouldn't have. And I haven't brought up the screen crunch. It's very hard to see what's coming. And the music isn't going to be as good either, but for Game Boy Color standards, it gets the job done. There were a few noticeable differences though. Some of the levels have been altered and one was even added. And the game also saves after each level. That's a big improvement over the original. In fact, Candy has you doing these challenges instead of just saving. The loading is also really fast. You'll get in and out of levels in just a couple seconds. And what the heck, I might as well bring up the two bonus minigames. Funky's Fishing is this fishing game where you grab fish to get points, and it's the easiest minigame of all time and you basically can't lose, but I always found it to be kinda novel. Crosshair Cranky has you shooting at crumblings at quick succession. This one is also fine, but it's not really that exciting. So there's really no reason to play Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Color unless you're morbidly curious. 21. Donkey Kong Land 2. I'm surprised that I'm putting this above the Game Boy Color version, but that's because the movement and physics are vastly improved. Moving around finally feels right, but the main fix is that the jumps are a bit more floaty and you don't fall as fast. Interestingly, Donkey Kong Land 2 does not take as much of a departure as Donkey Kong Land 1 does. This is very close to the DKC2 original in a lot of ways. The overworlds are similar looking, the music remixes are the same, the level gimmicks are all the same, and a couple of the side Kong characters return. The main difference here is the level design. All of that is, of course, unique. You play as Diddy and Dixie Kong, which is really nice because I've always liked Dixie's hair twirling move. It makes navigating big jumps a lot easier, which is really helpful with a game that has this much screen crunch. Even when you get hit, the game switches you to the next Kong way faster as well. And plus, you can see if you have an extra Kong or an extra hit point for your animal buddy at all times. There's a convenient little icon. It's honestly kind of crazy how much DKL2 improved over DKL1. And it doesn't have that awkward jumping glitch either, thank God for that. The only thing I wish it included was the Kongs dancing at the end of the levels. I was kind of missing that, I'm not gonna lie. And the bosses have been simplified a lot too. This isn't that surprising, of course, but they were stupid easy to beat compared to the SNES game. I don't know if I'd really say that Donkey Kong Land 2 is worth playing because the screen crunch is still an issue, but I have to applaud it for all the improvements that were made. 20. Donkey Kong Land 3. Why did they change from a number to Roman numerals? It's a mystery greater than life itself. Strangely enough, the Game Boy version was never released in Japan because they got a Game Boy Color version instead. It's titled Donkey Kong GB, Dinky Kong, and Dixie Kong. Ah yes, my favorite Kong member, Dinky Kong! So this game is kind of a demake of DKC3. You play as Dixie and Kiddy Kong and they control as you'd expect. All the improvements that DKL2 had carry over to DKL3, although there's no boat riding in the overworld. In fact, the overworld looks way different. It's very linear like the other Donkey Kong Land titles. And there's a couple other things worth mentioning. If you complete the game, you'll unlock Time Attack, which is honestly really cool. I wouldn't have thought a feature from the GBA remakes would make it to the Game Boy. Ellie also shoots water on command without having to suck any up, and Kiddy Kong gives me the funniest eyebrow raise when he finishes levels. Everything okay, buddy? The levels have a really good flow to them, which is why I'm ranking it as the highest in the trilogy. I really enjoyed going through these levels. Very rarely would I get hit because some enemy pops up at the last second. The levels were simply designed at a higher quality. Although I do have to point out that these things that shoot the nuts in the tree levels, they blended in way too much. Like, seriously, who's gonna notice this the first time playing? But overall, the Donkey Kong Land trilogy is novel and an interesting part of history. But honestly, they're just basic platformers that haven't aged very well. I wouldn't call DKL1 a great game to revisit, but DKL2 and 3, they're alright. I guess they'd be worth trying. 19. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. So, fun fact, this was the first game to get the E10 Plus rating. That is hilarious because it's just Donkey Kong. How graphic can it be? Well, it's a platformer where you move using the DK bongos. I was extremely hesitant to try this at first, and boy was it weird. You move by tapping the bongos left and right, jump by hitting both bongos, and do an attack by clapping. That's it, the controls are really as basic as that. The goal is to unlock these crests by getting bananas in the level, as these unlock all the kingdoms which contain said levels. The bananas also serve as a life bar, and getting hit by an enemy or boss will decrease your banana count. So I guess it's kind of the same idea as Sonic losing rings, except you'll never lose all your bananas at once. The first half of the game was a goddamn fever dream. It feels strange smashing your hands on bongos to move because it halfway feels unnatural and it halfway feels amazing when you're like smacking enemies around from the feedback of your hands. And then you've got the bosses. There's a new one after each kingdom, but they don't change until the very end. It's the same 4 repeated over and over, but they get slightly harder each time. One of these is a Kong where you have to time your punches and dodges swings to win, so it's basically Punch-Out! Then you got these sections where you ride a buffalo, and this is really damn satisfying too. You're building speed by mashing the bongos to get as high of a jump as possible, and it just feels satisfying. The end of the stage is great too. You can smash the ever-loving shit out of the bongos for some extra bananas, and I can't believe how nicely animated DK is for this segment. In fact, the whole game looks really nice. There's a bunch of interesting locales too. But then we get to the second half of the game. The levels start to get more intricate, and the bosses and enemies start moving around more erratically. Normally, this is how a game should function. You want it to get harder as you're going along and getting better. However, that doesn't translate very well with the bongo controller. Some of the levels require really precise movement, and it's extremely hard to judge how fast DK is going to move, or how much reach his jump will get. Joysticks have the same reach when using them, and you can build muscle memory much more easily because the motions are always the same. But with this game, I'm just smacking bongos with my entire hand, which makes it much more challenging to judge and finesse how DK will move on screen. Because of this, the levels at the end were extremely frustrating and kind of killed what made Jungle Beat so fun to begin with. I still think this is a really creative and solid game overall, but the last handful of levels should have been toned down a bit more. Of course, you could just say skill issue, but come on, look at what I'm working with here. 18. Diddy Kong Racing DS. If you ever wanted to play Diddy Kong Racing, but everything about it is worse or slightly mediocre, then this is the game for you. While it's great to see Diddy Kong Racing get a remake at all, the DS was not a good pick to do so. This is largely the same as the N64 Classic, but it also has a lot of differences, and I don't really like any of them. For starters, Banjo and Conker were removed because of the Rare acquisition, and in their place are Dixie and Tiny Kong. While I don't like that they had to do that, I understand completely, and these are okay picks for what it's worth. At least you can play as Wizpig and Taj now, that's a fun little bonus. There's some new tracks to play on too, but they're just okay. They aren't all that memorable because they don't have any sort of distinct theme, they just kind of exist. You can also design your own tracks, which is an amazing idea and concept, but it's so bare bones that it's not worth the trouble at all. All you do here is draw a path with your stylus, and that's it. Yep, that is it. You have no control of where the items go, what they are, or what even the elevation looks like. You can't even pick a theme. It all takes place in this strange cloudy area. But all of this isn't really the meat and butter of the problem. The physics and controls feel completely different. Everything is stiffer and heavier feeling. And not only that, but every track has been brought back, and they've all been altered to be way more flat and straightforward. The natural bumpiness from the original is almost entirely gone outside of a few exceptions. And I think that's because airtime in the car feels janky now. You kinda get locked into place while in the air until you land again. So instead of tweaking the movement to fix that, the tracks are instead way more dull to play as a result. And then there's the map screen. What the heck happened? It serves its purpose somewhat, but the orientation is not the same as what's displayed on screen, so it's not very helpful at all. Mario Kart DS achieved this perfectly by keeping the orientation of the map the same as the perspective of the player, so I'm not sure why it's like this. And dude, you use the touchscreen or microphone to get the starting boost. That is so dumb. This comes off as a blatant example of developers feeling pressured to use the touchscreen gimmicks that just aren't necessary. The silver coin challenges aren't included either. It's been replaced with this touch balloon challenge. Again, I really like the idea of this, but the execution just doesn't work. You have to tap a bunch of balloons while moving automatically, but you also move the camera by dragging the touchscreen. This means that you'll be frantically moving the stylus all over the place and missing balloons because you were forced to move the screen. Why not map the camera control to the D-pad or something? And the hovercraft is not great either. It's harder to control now and way more slippery than before. With the original game, the challenge with controlling the hovercraft is continuously turning without losing speed. You had to find this sense of flow by not turning too sharp, which made it really fun to master. Diddy Kong Racing DS is nothing like that. The hovercraft just slides you across the ground the entire time. I don't even like the music. It's still great tunes, but the quality has been downgraded because this is on a DS. Now, look, I know I just spent a lot of time criticizing this game, but that's because I love the original so much. This version is still functional and playable, but there's not many redeeming factors outside of the fact that it was a portable version for its time. 17. DK King of Swing. Another day, another DK game with gimmicky control schemes. Although this time, it's one of the better ideas. The main premise is to clear levels by pushing the R and L button to swing around. You can also hold the L and R button to do a little jump, and this also attacks enemies and breaks boxes. It's a fairly simple idea, and I was enjoying it for a while. The bananas are also used for health, and if you get 10, then you can refill one of your hearts. Or you can use the bananas for temporary invincibility. So you've got a little bit of a trade-off mechanic. And you know what? It's oddly satisfying swinging yourself around. The momentum actually works fairly well. DK will always spin if he's grabbing one peg, which means you can time when to use jumps to get the most height or distance. You can also use the D-pad for running on the ground, and even adjusting your air movement a bit. But of course, like every other gimmicky DK game, King of Swing falls apart near the end. Once you get to the ice world, that's when it goes to shit. the levels start to get more and more annoying, especially with the ice blocks. Dear God, who thought it was a good idea to add ice blocks into a game like this? See, this is the problem with designing an entire game around one gimmick. There's nothing wrong necessarily with trying out new control schemes like this, obviously, but when you limit the basic controls this much, it's naturally going to make the later levels difficult not because of the level itself, but because of the controls. And honestly, the swinging gets old after a while. There are some interesting ideas in here, like pulling on a lever or throwing rocks at enemies, but you're mostly just swinging around. And that makes every level look the same since you have to use the pegs to climb up. I will give some credit to the bosses though. There's a couple of really good ones in here. My favorite was Davone's locker. You had to grab his tail and then get close enough to spikes and let DK spin to nail a bunch of hits at once. It was really satisfying. And then there's another mode on top of that, Single Jungle Jam. Here, you can play as a bunch of different characters. Even Bubbles makes an appearance, which is really neat. This Jungle Jam has a few different modes, like racing to the top, battling, trying to break barrels, and so on. King of Swing is a decent enough title, but nothing more than a neat little novelty. 16. Donkey Kong 64. I've literally wanted to play this since I was like 8 years old. I remember as a kid, I was at a friend's house eating Pringles for the first time, and I watched my friend play Donkey Kong 64 for about 30 minutes. It was mystifying at the time. It looked so interesting, but I never had a chance to try it. And here we are now, and the game opens with the DK rap. It's one of the best and corniest rap songs of all time. It's even in the Mario movie, for crying out loud. I've also always loved this in-your-face menu with DK throwing the barrels at you. That's something I really miss about this era of games. The menus weren't afraid to be fun and exciting, while still maintaining a good sense of direction. So DK64 is a 3D platformer where you play as 5 different Kongs, which initially sounds pretty awesome. Although it's really strange you can't play as Dixie or Kitty Kong. What was wrong with including them? Instead, we've got Tiny and Chunky Kong. Which, I mean, they're fine too, but I just don't get why we needed new Kongs. I was really curious how the controls were gonna feel, as they tend to be a bit janky for early 3D titles. But you know what? I thought they worked well. Every character moves pretty fluidly for the most part, and they all have their own distinct movement. Vine swinging is also pretty easy since it just requires proper timing with the A button, which I think is the best choice in this 3D space. I do have to admit that the movement itself feels pretty slow. It's the same issue that Banjo-Kazooie has. I wanna like that game more, but actually exploring the areas takes forever to do and gets really tedious. The camera is also a pain in the ass, as it often lags behind you and doesn't work very well in general. But we'll get to the bad parts later. I was cracking up using Donkey Kong because he moans every time he rolls. Like, I can't tell if he's in pain or pleasure. Cranky Kong returns as well and gives you new moves throughout the game. These new moves can change the characters a lot, like Diddy Kong gets an entire rocket barrel where you fly around the level. Then you got Funky Kong, who turns the monkeys into true Americans and gives every character a unique kind of gun. Candy Kong is back too and gives every Kong an instrument, which can be used a few different ways in game, but did they really need to give her the biggest knockers of all time? I mean, Jesus Christ, is this not a little excessive? But whatever. Some of these worlds are pretty neat even to this day. My favorite is still the main hub, DK Island. The song that plays is so peaceful, it makes me feel all warm inside. I've always loved how relaxing it is. The music is pretty solid throughout the entire game, but that's not much of a surprise. This is Donkey Kong. So at this point, I've pretty much talked about all the positives because oh goody oh boy. This has to be the most drawn out and padded 3D platformer that I've ever played in my life. Now, as you'd expect with any 3D platformer, the main objective is to collect things to make progress, and you'll do this by finding bananas, specifically colored bananas that are catered to the character you're playing as. You also need to get golden bananas, and these are typically found by completing specific challenges. There's also banana bunch coins, which is the currency to upgrade your moves, and banana medals are collected after getting 75 bananas in a level. These aren't as important, as they just unlock Jetpack, which is an old rare game, but it's still something you can get. The main problem with all this is that every character has their own unique bananas and banana coins to collect. So Diddy can only get red, Linky blue, Tiny purple, and so on. The reason this sucks so much is because you can only swap characters in these tag barrels, and there's not that many in each level. So what this means is you're basically forced to play every level 5 times over. And not just that, but you gotta talk to Cranky, Candy, and Funky Kong all those times as well to get your upgrades for each character to make progress. Now, I knew all of this going into the game as it's a well-known criticism, but I didn't think I would mind that much. I enjoy a lot of different 3D platformers, so I figured that bias would carry over to some extent. But oh boy, Donkey Kong 64 is a beast that sits on its own scale. It is so much more tedious than I could have imagined. Because the movement is so slow and the game runs at a pretty low frame rate, it's like walking through sand the entire way through. Oh my god, the game never seems to end. You will spend hours and hours retreading your steps in the same level, and it's so boring. Now, there are banana ports which allow you to warp around levels, and this helps a little bit for sure, but I'm not that familiar with this game, so I don't remember where half of these warp points are to begin with. DK64 could have been such a better game if it had two minor changes. One, allow us to change Kongs on the fly, and two, give us a map when pausing the game and let us warp to the warp points that way. Seriously, these two changes would have made Donkey Kong 64 100 times better. But of course, that's not how the game works. Because of that, I really don't have any desire to revisit this game in the future. It's really not worth replaying at all. There is a mod out there where you can swap the Kongs whenever you want, so I guess you could try that instead. And there's a few other things to bring up. The bosses are not all that great. They're pretty damn easy, and King K. Rool in particular takes freaking forever to get through. Rambi and Enguarde return as animal buddies, which is cool, but where the heck are the other ones? So many of these enemies were brought over from the country games, but not the animal buddies for some reason. I will give some props to the multiplayer though. The multiplayer is still a lot of fun, and works because every character has a weapon in the main game already. I've played this a few times with friends, and it was always a great time. But yeah, I really wanted to like DK64 more. It's just one of those games that really needs a remake that rehauls how swapping characters work. Or honestly, just screw it, let's get a new 3D DK already. What's taking so long? 15. DK Jungle Climber. Out of all the gimmicky DK games, this one is actually pretty decent. I wasn't expecting to say that after playing through King of Swing, but they fixed a lot of the issues that game had. Like before, you still use R and L to swing around on the pegs. A lot of the same elements like the lever and fast spinning pegs are included too, but the controls have been heavily updated. For one, you can hold the R and L button while in the air and automatically lock onto pegs. As far as I could tell, that wasn't possible in King of Swing, and this makes grabbing pegs much easier. But the biggest upgrade by far is the jumping. You no longer have to hold R and L to jump. You just push the A button, and it can be done off the ground or off a peg. This completely changes how the game feels. While there's still an element of challenge when it comes to aiming for pegs, just the fact that I can push the A button to jump is a huge relief. Another thing I noticed too is when you collide with a wall, you don't get tossed backwards and drop the peg you were holding. This made the later levels actually manageable, and the overall movement speed seems to be faster as well. The momentum functions better when you're in the air too. Like, I don't think I can iterate enough how much the controls have improved. I was initially dreading the idea of playing Jungle Climber, but ended up enjoying it almost the whole way through. But I'm still not done with gameplay changes, because now you can use Diddy Kong. He can be utilized as an extra hit point, attacking enemies from far away and using special items. The hammer and torch specifically break through tough platforms, and it's a nice way to freshen up the levels. Speaking of getting hit though, you may have noticed the lack of a health bar. Well, that's because you don't have one. It's been replaced with a life system, which is pretty lame if you ask me. But this is easily remedied because you can unlock a cheat to come back from a game over with 20 lives instead of 5, so it's not really an issue. There's actually a lot of new collectibles too. You've got the big DK coins, which unlock cheats, banana coins unlock extra levels, Kong panels for lives, and we've also got gems. Getting 100 of these nets you a crystal star, which gives you temporary invincibility and the option to fly wherever you want. Dude, what a huge upgrade in abilities! Pretty much everything has been significantly enhanced. Even the music goes pretty hard. I was digging the title screen tune as well as many of the others. And just look at this world map. You move through it so fluidly, and it's in this cool 3D perspective. Massive props to whoever put that together. I will admit that the sprites aren't quite as charming as the GBA version, but they still look pretty good. There's a bit more of a story too, although it essentially boils down to K. Rool stealing some crystal banana or whatever, and you have to get it back. The reason I bring this up though is because you meet this guy called Zananab. It's a talking banana that takes us through wormholes. Need I say more? Man, there are so many neat little things in Jungle Climber, like this level on Ghost Island. Diddy holds a map that's shown on the bottom screen, and you have to find your way around by looking at it and keeping track of DK's location. The bosses were fantastic as well. They even brought back the dragon dude that I liked from the GBA title. Now, of course, no game is perfect, and I wasn't a fan of the last few levels. First off, they brought back those stupid ice blocks, but at least the level design was a bit more forgiving, so I'll give it that. But my main gripe is with a level called Toy Box 3. You're forced to take this huge-ass ball to a pin to pop it, which, sounds easy enough. However, there's times where you have to continuously aim and launch this ball high into the air, while also being surrounded by walls that change the ball's direction constantly. So what happens is you hit the ball one direction, and 2 seconds later, it's getting pushed back another way, and it feels like sheer dumb luck getting the ball to where it needs to go. It was incredibly annoying to say the least. Like with King of Swing, there's some bonus modes to check out, and these are just okay. We've got a challenge mode, which is more mini games, but a lot of these just come from the tutorial level. There's also extra stages, which I gotta be honest, I couldn't beat them. I do not have the skills or patience for them at all, but hey, I was enjoying what might be the jazziest DS music I'd ever heard. But yeah, despite a few hiccups, DK Jungle Climber is pretty solid. It's not as good as the regular platformers, but I can appreciate them trying something a little different and actually making it work well. 14. Donkey Konga. I was not expecting to enjoy Donkey Konga so much, but let's also keep in mind that I love rhythm games. Seriously, I played thousands of hours of Guitar Hero and Rock Band, so a game like this speaks to me on another level. Now, Donkey Konga is basically a precursor to Taiko, a rhythm series found in the arcades where you smack huge drums to hit notes. There's console versions of Taiko too. I've got one of the games on the Switch, but anyway. I learned that Reggie apparently hated this game and thought it would hurt the DK brand. While I do agree with him to an extent, I love just imagining Reggie coming into the office one day, hearing about the game, and just fuming over a monkey hitting bongos. The image just sounds hilarious. And speaking of the bongos, that's what I use to play. You can use a regular controller too, but what's the fun in that? The controls are pretty basic. Yellow notes are hitting the left side, red is right side, pink is both, and white is clapping. Yes, there's a microphone built into the bongos so you can actually clap to hit notes. At first, I actually kind of hated it. I wasn't hitting notes and thought that the clapping noise was breaking my score streak. But that wasn't the actual issue. In fact, you can clap whenever you want without consequence. I was simply hitting the notes late, as Donkey Konga requires you to hit notes earlier than I'm used to. So once I adjusted to that, I was having a killer time. It's kind of shocking how accurate the bongos are. I can't believe mine still work as well as they do. The song list is fairly small, but it's got some bangers in here. There's some classical music, some Nintendo stuff like the DK rap and Zelda theme, but lots of pop and rock tunes as well. We Will Rock You, All the Small Things, Rock Lobster, Whip It. There's some pretty iconic picks in here. Granted, a lot of these songs are covers because I imagine buying the license from Blink-182 or Cream would cost them an arm and leg, but they're still pretty fun to have regardless. You can even change how your bongo sounds, whether you want crappy NES blips or slick electric drums. There's a lot of selection here. I also love how Ellie and Diddy Kong are just jamming at the bottom the whole time. Taiko games are so sick, man. Outside of the core game, however, there's really not much else to talk about. There are a few other modes and unlockables, but that's where Donkey Konga is lacking. There's a challenge mode, which is essentially playing the same music in a random playlist. Jam Session is the same as the regular mode, but now you can see the accuracy of your hits in real time, so I wouldn't really call it a unique mode. DK Town is where you can buy stuff like new drum sound effects, mini games, and even expert songs. Yes, the hard mode has to be purchased song by song through in-game coins. That is incredibly stupid. Why do I have to unlock a difficulty mode in a rhythm game? And also, the cost of this stuff is insanely expensive. Unlocking everything is going to take a lot of grinding. I also found my hands getting a little sore from all the smacking, but that's probably because I'm not used to it and played over 3 hours in one sitting. As for the minigames, well, they're just okay. Bash K Rule is just whack-a-mole, and 100M Vine Climb is climbing up a vine and collecting fruit. Banana Juggle was a fun idea though. You have to juggle bananas and get as high of a score as possible before time runs out. The trick, however, is that clapping adds a banana to your juggle, so you have to pre-plan when to add bananas and try your best to avoid dropping any. So is this a much shorter and less dense game than DK64? Absolutely, but I'd much rather replay this than a huge convoluted 3D platformer that doesn't respect your time. 13. Donkey Konga 2. This barely edges over the first game, and that's because I enjoyed the song selection a little more. Donkey Konga 2 is pretty much the same game otherwise. You're still hitting notes with the bongos and all that jazz. I found the songs to be a little more mellow compared to the first game, and I was really jiving with them. Plus, this one has a cover of All Star, so you can't really go wrong there. The UI has also been updated, and I like it a lot more than the first title. It's much easier to find things now, and is better organized overall. You can also keep track of your high score after every song, although strangely, you have to use a picture instead of writing out your name? I mean, I suppose it'd take a while to type out initials with the bongos, but that's weird how the only option to save your score is with a photo. As for the other modes and unlockables, well, it's a little different, but hasn't really been improved. We get 2 new minigames, and you don't have to buy them from the shop this time. Instead, you have to spend coins to play the minigames, which is honestly kind of worse if you ask me, because all the unlockables are expensive as hell yet again. But for the minigames, we'll start with Barrel Race, and I gotta say, it's pretty eh. All you do is hit notes in quick succession before the other person. Fascinating. Then there's Keep the Rhythm, and it's just hitting notes again, except they go invisible after a while. The minigames are even less inspired than before. It's not that they're adding much value to begin with, but it's just bizarre to see them included since they hardly stand out as their own thing. The challenge mode also returns and is unchanged, but now you can have a set number of songs to play. While that's nice and all, why isn't there an option to select however many I want, or even just a time limit? Would it have been that hard to implement? Beyond that though, we've got 2 brand new modes, and they aren't much to write home about. Freestyle Zone has you hitting the bongos at random to make your own beat, and each time you hit something, a PNG of a Donkey Kong character pops up. Wow. I mean, I guess this would have been kinda neat if we could use actual drums, but these bongo controllers aren't sensitive enough to create proper beats at all. Then finally, we have Concert. It's a co-op mode where one person claps and the other person hits the drums. Couldn't you just do this with the main game with any song? Like, what makes this so different? You could really tell that they tried to expand on the first title, and I can at least applaud the attempt here, but man, the side content just kind of exists. While I don't think the extra modes have any real value, the core gameplay is still great, and that's what really matters at the end of the day. 12. New play control, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. I have to admit, I'm kind of shocked at how much better this version of Jungle Beat is. The main addition is that you can now use a joystick to move and the A button to jump. Thank freaking God they've made that change. It makes the entire game so much more playable. While I absolutely adored using the bongos, now I actually feel like I'm in control. But that's not the only gameplay change. The sound wave attack that you do by shaking the remote is no longer a radius. It's now directional, which means you have to aim more accurately when stunning enemies with it. And I am completely on board with this change simply because it's much easier to move around the levels. It makes sense. The way the bananas work is a little bit different too. They're still required to unlock the crest, but they don't pair with your health. Instead, you get 3 hearts for each stage, and a life bar for the bosses. While it's not as interesting as the GameCube version, once again, it's a smart change. It was pretty unfair to fight a new boss in the original, only to lose a ton of bananas because you didn't understand the patterns yet. They also added what's basically a boss rush and a new level. The new level isn't anything crazy, it's just a celebration for beating the game, and it's filled to the brim with bananas. So, needless to say, this version is vastly superior to the original. There's really no reason to play the GameCube one, unless you really want to experience the novelty of the bongos. 11. Donkey Kong Country. I think this is maybe the 3rd or 4th time I've played through this game, and each time I play it, I enjoy it a little bit more. It's of course the superior version compared to the Game Boy Color. The graphics still look really great and are impressive for the time period. That's something I've always liked about this franchise. It's always tried to push the limits on visuals, and Donkey Kong Country far succeeds with that. The animal buddies are a lot of fun to use too, with Rambi and Espresso being my favorites. There's nothing better than hopping onto one of them and absolutely plowing through a stage. It's super exhilarating. In all the levels, you can find 4 letters that spell out Kong. All they do is give you an extra life, which is kind of neat I suppose, but there's also a code that gives you 50 lives right at the beginning, making that kind of pointless. They're still fun to collect though, since they tend to be put in tougher hidden areas. There's also golden animal collectibles, and getting 3 of these takes you to a bonus level for more lives. Again, it's already easy to get lives, but it still feels special to reach a bonus room and go crazy with one of the animals. And there's a surprising amount of level variety too. You got your classic jungle levels shooting from barrel to barrel, the scary minecart ones, the slippery ass snow areas, the caves that have on and off switches, and plenty more. These level themes do repeat themselves, but they're really smart about it in making repeating themes distinct. Going back to the minecarts, the first one has you jumping from rail to rail. The second one is the same idea, but you physically jump out of the minecart instead and have to land back in. Then there's the on and off switches. One level disables enemies while another activates the lights. In between each level, there's a few other things you can do. You can talk to Cranky, who honestly has nothing important to say, but he's chill. Then Funky Kong lets you fly around to other areas, and Candy is for saving. The saving system is pretty archaic in design, admittedly. I mean, we should be able to simply save after beating a level, but since lives are easy to get, it's not much of a problem. And man, the music is amazing too. I love that it goes for an atmospheric tone, and it works beautifully. Whether it's Aquatic Ambience's soothing sweep, or DK Island Swing hyping you up, or Minecart Madness giving off a frantic and dark tone. Even the game over screen is charming. It looks like DK and Diddy just left a pub and lost a bar fight. But with all that said, this is not a perfect game. I honestly used to not like Donkey Kong Country, and it's still not a favorite of mine. Once I finished it yet again and really thought about why I felt this way, I realized it comes down to 3 issues, one of the small ones being the bosses. While there's a lot of cool designs here, they're all really easy and repeat themselves. Although I can appreciate King K. Rool's fake out credits, and the Gangplank Galleon music absolutely bangs. The 2 real problems come down to the camera and hitboxes. We'll start with the camera, because it infuriates me sometimes. This is not completely the game's fault, because the SNES could only offer a 4:3 screen ratio, but the freaking camera lags behind you fairly often, meaning it's really easy to get hit by enemies just because there's no time to see them coming. This in particular is what made me realize why I've never had much desire to revisit the SNES DK games. The camera can be really frustrating. It was almost like I had to memorize the harder levels just to get through them, and I wasn't jiving with that. And then finally, the hitboxes can be really wonky. Sometimes I'll jump on an enemy and take it out, and sometimes I'll get hit. Even if I'm jumping at the same angle and spot, there's always a chance I get hit for no reason. Now, I don't know if anybody else shares these thoughts with me. I feel like the answer is gonna be no as usual. I'm not trying to be contrarian, I swear, but it feels nice to finally comprehend why I've always preferred Mario over DK. But I've definitely grown to appreciate this trilogy a lot more. It's an iconic classic that will likely stand the test of time. 10. Donkey Kong Country Game Boy Advance. Yep, I actually prefer the Game Boy Advance ports. The main reason is because the screen is zoomed out, which makes it easier to see what's coming. Just look at this side to side, it's a pretty big difference. This was my #1 issue with the original game, and now it's mostly solved. The only problem at this point is the vertical scaling hasn't been adjusted, so climbing up and down levels still feel the same as the SNES versions. But regardless, that only arises for a small amount of levels. For the most part, the GBA version makes it easier to react to what's coming up while still retaining the same feel and difficulty. There's actually a lot of small changes worth talking about, like the fact that they added in an intro cutscene which is based off the story in the manual. That's really cool. The enemies all have unique voice clips, and there's more sound effects in general. And like a lot of GBA ports, Donkey and Diddy Kong have voice lines now, which is very akin to the Mario Advance games. The music isn't quite as good, obviously, but it still works and sounds similar enough. And look at that overworld map. Holy crap, it almost looks like a damn painting now, and it has moving parts like the waves in the water. The minigames return from the Game Boy Color version, or well, I guess the fishing's back at least. Funky's Fishing has a really chill tune, and there's actual goals now instead of just catching fish. Candy also has a minigame called Candy's Dance Studio. It's a basic rhythm game where you tap the shown button to the beat, but then we've got the bosses. They even improved some of these. Like the oil drum boss has to be hit by TNT instead of just nothing. Really Naughty also drops stalactites, and a couple others have been tweaked for the better. There's even a DK attack mode, which basically is just time attack. You run through a level as fast as possible while collecting extra time to increase your rank, and it's solid. The main downside here is the sprite work. It's not as detailed as the original, of course, but I think they did the best they could. The main problem is the brightness. You may have noticed just how bright all the levels are. That's because this was released at a time before the GBA SP was released. Since there was no backlight, a lot of GBA games made their pixels extra bright so they'd be easier to see. While it's a nice gesture, it does ruin the vibe of the darker levels that take place in caves. I could see that bothering some people, but I don't mind that much. Just the fact that we have more screen space makes this so much better. 9. Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy Kong's Quest. This was my first time fully beating the DKC sequel, and I was pleasantly surprised. I don't think it fixed my core issues from the first game, but it made quite a few improvements, the biggest one being the bosses. Not only are they a lot more dynamic and interesting, but they were a lot tougher. The boss patterns required some practice to get the hang of, which made them a lot more enjoyable than Country 1's fights. You also don't play as Donkey Kong since he's been trapped by K. Rool, so joining Diddy is Dixie Kong. I really liked using her because she has this hair whip move where she can glide until hitting the ground, and it was helpful in many circumstances. I can't tell you how many times I would switch to Dixie just to clear some huge gap or more easily avoid enemies. And props to Rare as well for having the balls to do this to begin with. They could have easily just given us Donkey and Diddy Kong again and no one would have complained. Dixie and Diddy as a team are simply more enjoyable to use in general. And speaking of teaming up, now you can use team up moves which get you a little bit of extra height. These are usually used to access bonus areas, which are much more important in Diddy Kong's quest. See, the level design is a bit more open with multiple paths, and that's because you want to hunt down the bonus levels to get DK coins and Creme coins. Finding enough Creme coins can be used to unlock new levels in the Lost World, so there's a good reason to hunt these things down. I also love the winning animations that Diddy and Dixie Kong have after clearing a level. You can just tell the developers are having a blast making this game. There's a couple new characters too. First, we got Wrinkly Kong. You use banana coins to pay for lessons about levels if you want, and look at her chalkboard. The equations are completely wrong. This is also how you save the game, which you can do for free one time, but then you have to pay to save. This is, well, I mean, obviously it's dumb, but again, there's a 50 lives code that anyone can use without trouble, so the save system barely matters. Swinky Kong is another new one, and he hosts a quiz show. If we get the questions right, we get a reward, and it's pretty silly. As for the level themes, well, they're just as creative as ever. A lot of them are based around pirates, which is really cool, while other themes from DKC 1 return. The water levels all manage to have their own unique spin to them, and same with the minecart stages. My favorite was probably the timer one. You have to hit barrels with green pluses to add time and avoid the red minus ones. It was intense and scary, which made it all the more satisfying to clear. The standout level is Bramble Blast. You can tell the developers really put their all into this one. The music is incredibly soothing, and the environment is beyond dreamy. You're surrounded by vines that have filled up the sky. And while I love the vibe, it gets old fairly quickly considering all we're doing is shooting through barrels the whole time. But man, that music is just fantastic. It might be my favorite Donkey Kong song of all time. I also have to comment on the overworld, because I found navigation to be confusing. And that's mostly because the icons would often blend into the background, making it awkward to figure out where to go. Now, yes, I know there's arrows, but oftentimes you don't really go the direction of the arrows. Parts of the overworld were just a strange oddity. So with that said, I would say DKC2 has an edge over the first game. I still don't like the camera, and I found the hitboxes to be very inconsistent yet again. So not much has changed there, but it's still well worthy of playing. 8. Donkey Kong Country 2 Game Boy Advance. Like the other GBA remake, DKC2 is very similar in terms of its advantages. The screen is zoomed out more, the save system is more forgiving, hitboxes are a little more generous, it's better in almost every way. And like with the DKC1 remake, this one has also added an intro cutscene. And yet again, it's based on the story in the manual, which is pretty awesome. The overworld has also been recreated, and it looks a lot nicer than before and is easier to follow. It's interesting how zoomed in it's gotten, but I still like it a lot more now. There's also an entire new boss named Kirozine. He's this big red dinosaur dude with swords and breathes fire. I find it amusing how only his head and arms move, and his body doesn't react to anything else. There's also a few new mini-games, and these are hit and miss. Espresso's Racing has you racing as the ostrich himself, and you run across speed panels to win. It's decent fun. Then there's Funky Flights. You fly around in a gyrocopter while completing a variety of challenges. I don't mind this one either. There's a good amount of variety for your tasks as well. Vagabug, however, is kinda stupid. You try to collect these fireflies while a Clubba walks around, and he smashes you if you get too close. It's pretty annoying having to wait for Clubba to pass by, and it seems like the fireflies never show up when you want them to. Outside of that though, I don't have much else to say that hasn't already been said. If you didn't like the camera and the SNES version of DKC like myself, then these GBA versions are absolutely worth trying out. 7. Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. I gotta be honest, I did not expect to put this game as the highest in the trilogy. I mean, just look at Kiddy Kong. Bro carries a pacifier with him at all times. He's literally a toddler, and the only reason we play as him is because Dixie Kong was forced to bring her cousin with. In terms of how he controls, well, he's very similar to Donkey Kong. He moves a bit slower, but they're essentially the same character. As for the actual game, it's more of what you'd expect, but I found every good aspect of this trilogy has been perfected in DKC 3. To start, the levels mostly follow the structure of DKC 2. You'll find hidden barrels to go to bonus rooms, which is where you get the coins to unlock the extra levels. But on top of that, there's a few levels that are meant to be played fast, which is similar to DKC 1. I really like that the third game has both level styles included, which I see as a win-win. The overworld is way better now too, especially compared to the second game where it was really confusing and convoluted. That's been completely remedied in DKC 3. Not only do the maps look great and are easy to follow, but you even use a boat and travel from island to island. And on top of that, beating bosses unlocks parts to upgrade your boat and lets you explore islands that you couldn't before. So yes, this is pretty much Sonic Rush Adventure, but without having to grind levels. I can't believe I'm making that comparison. A lot of the same characters return, although Swanky Kong now includes a minigame instead of quizzes. I found this to be a lot more fun, honestly, and the perspective was pretty cool as well. And when you visit Wrinkly Kong, she's playing an N64 and you can hear the castle music from Mario 64. This makes her the most goated grandma, right? The animal buddies are mostly great too, and I really liked using Ellie the elephant. She's not quite as strong as Rambi and is scared of rats for some reason, but she can also suck up barrels and throw them. And she can hold water in her trunk and use it later as an attack. So honestly, a pretty neat inclusion. The only animal buddy I didn't like is Squitter. He may be able to jump off his webs an infinite amount of times, but he feels clunky and is really slow. I don't know why they brought him back from DKC 2. He wasn't that great to use in that game either. The levels themselves though are what really stand out. While there were still moments where the camera and hitboxes were annoying, that seemed to be much less of a problem in DKC 3. The themes are just incredible as well. My favorite was the tree levels where you're climbing these massive trees and hopping from branch to branch. It felt like a perfect evolution to the classic jungle theme. I have to wonder, was Cuphead inspired by this game? Cuphead's got a tree level where you're climbing up in a similar manner. Just something to think about. Then there's this cool water level where a fish is following you the whole time, and to survive, you have to keep luring it towards other fish so it's well fed. If you don't do that, it'll get hungry and start attacking you. Again, Rare has done a fantastic job making levels feel unique and have their own identity. The minecart stages have been replaced by toboggans, which is a nice little change-up. Flying down the snowy hills was a blast, and same with these low-gravity levels. It changes the dynamic completely. The only thing that sucks is that you don't get a cool dance animation after beating a level. Where the heck is Dixie Kong's guitar solo? She just pulls on a rope now and that's it. Dumb. But on to the bosses. These are also really great with a couple of standouts. My favorite was probably Belch's burp. You throw bugs into its mouth, and it burps so powerfully that it gets launched backwards. You have to keep making him burp so he'll launch himself off the stage to win. It's such a silly and fun idea. And then the 3D snowman fight was awesome too. Having to chuck snowballs from close up to long distance, it was great. The only stage I didn't like was Poisonous Pipeline because it reverses your controls. That one was a pain in the ass. But overall, I'm amazed at how much more I like this game compared to the first two. Maybe that's an unpopular opinion, but DKC 3 made me realize why people enjoy this franchise so much. 6. Donkey Kong Country 3 Game Boy Advance. Out of all the GBA versions, this one has the most changes by far. There's an entire new world, a new boss, Croctopus, and a new soundtrack. I've heard some say the soundtrack kind of sucks, but I'm honestly indifferent to it. It's a lot more upbeat compared to the original, and some say that it ruins the tone of some of the levels. While I can understand that to an extent, I still think this new soundtrack is pretty solid. I'm not that concerned about it, simply because, like the other GBA remakes, the screen is more zoomed out, which makes gameplay a lot better. An intro cutscene was added in here as well, and the overworld map is once again updated. What's most surprising is the fact that there's an entire new world to play, and it has 6 levels instead of the usual 5, so they really went all out here. These new levels are about the same quality as the others in DKC 3. There aren't any new themes, but it's still nice to have some extra content regardless. The minigames are brand new, and these are my favorite out of all the bonus games from the GBA remakes. First, we've got Cranky's Dojo. You have to block off bristles as they fly towards Cranky. It's simple fun, and I think it was enjoyable and neat to actually control Cranky for once. Then there's Swanky's Dash. It's this cool looking 3D runner that reminds me of the Knuckles Chaotix special stages. This one's just alright though. It's a little hard to get the stars since you can't turn very fast, but not bad. And finally, Funky Kong gives you control of a boat and you'll complete a variety of missions. Controlling the boat here feels great to do, and at the end of the day, I'm glad that this much extra effort was even added in. As strange as it is to say, this has to be my favorite old school Donkey Kong Country game. Who would have thought I'd be saying that about a remake on the Game Boy Advance? 5. Donkey Kong Country Returns. Every issue that I had with the original SNES trilogy has been completely resolved with Donkey Kong Country Returns. The widescreen makes Donkey Kong so enjoyable to play. I can actually see what's coming instead of being surprised half the time. And this is one hell of a nice looking game. Even on the Wii, it still looks fantastic. The characters are animated expressively and feel fluid, and the environments are lush and full of detail. Every world feels very distinct from one another. It's really refreshing after seeing so much blandness from 2D Mario Mario in this time period. Everyone talks about the cool level where everything is a silhouette, but I honestly think every level looks fantastic. The controls are pretty similar to the SNES games, except for two major changes. For one, your roll is really fast this time. You get a nice speed boost from it. It makes doing long jumps not only more useful, but more satisfying. And two, Diddy Kong isn't exactly playable. You can still use them, but will instead attach to DK and give you a few seconds to glide. While I'd rather have just been able to play as Diddy Kong, I don't mind that they tried something a little different here. You can also grab onto patches of grass and hang off them at any angle. It's kind of like vine grabbing, but a little more handy and flexible. The mechanics are really well put together, and you can also slap the ground to hit plants and find hidden puzzle pieces or bananas. And that soundtrack, it remixes tons of classic DK music and is out of this world catchy. Dude, they brought back the minecart levels, and wow, these go so hard! There's a handful of them to play, and each one gets more and more intense. What makes them so damn cool is the landscape around you interacts with where you're going. Oftentimes, huge chunks of land or bombs will destroy the track right in front of you, and you have to survive while the track is getting demolished. It feels right out of an Indiana Jones movie at times. There's even parts where you're trapped inside some sort of circle, and have to survive inside of it. It genuinely feels like an adventure, and I haven't even brought up the new jetpack levels. You ride a jet barrel and have to avoid obstacles, and I like these too. It took a while to get used to the controls since you have to carefully tap or you'll go shooting up and down, but they're pretty fun levels overall. Even Rambi makes a return, but is shockingly underutilized. I think he might be in 3 levels or something, and he's the only animal buddy. I don't know what it is with modern Donkey Kong. Can we please have more than one animal buddy again? At least Cranky Kong is back. He gives you the option to purchase extra lives and unlock bonus levels with banana coins. Pretty much every aspect from the SNES games are included here. But there's one glaring issue. You are forced to shake the remote to roll, slap the ground, and blow. While this is something that you can get used to, it really feels like every Wii game just had to have motion controls shoved in. The game is still playable, but it would have been so much better if there was an option to only use buttons. While I'm not really a fan of this, it's not bad enough to butcher the game as it's still well worth playing. 4. Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D. This is a bit of an oddity. Seeing Wii games on a 3DS is still kind of bizarre to me. I found this version to be slightly better as it has a decent amount of improvements. The biggest and best one, of course, being that there's no more motion controls. Instead of shaking, you just push X or Y, and that one change makes the game way more enjoyable. But that's not all they did. There's also a new easy mode that adds an extra heart to your health. And honestly, this is one of the few Nintendo games where this is actually warranted. DKC Returns gets hard by the end. Those later levels can be very unforgiving, so having a couple extra hit points helps in the later half of the game. There's also a bunch of new levels to play after beating the final boss. 8 levels were added and are all based on previous worlds. These levels are pretty fun to go through, and it was my first time trying out the Golden Temple stage. And damn, this level is hard as hell. This reminds me of the perfect run from Mario Galaxy 2, or Champions Road from Mario 3D World. Cranky Kong's shop also has a couple new items, and they're slightly cheaper. I also like that you can see your collectibles on the bottom screen at all times. All of this is good and dandy, but if you're watching this video and not listening to it, you can see one problem. DKC Returns 3D runs at 30 frames a second. Now, I'm no frame rate stickler usually, but some games really do benefit from running at 60 frames. Racing titles and platformers are usually more fun at a higher frame rate because the action is more pinpoint and on the fly. But this is on the 3DS, so I can't be that surprised that the frame rate and the graphics had to be sacrificed a bit. But even still, just the fact that you control everything with buttons makes it so much better. 3. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. I can't believe we're talking about this game yet again, but Nintendo re-released it on the Switch. While the loading times are a touch longer, this is by far the definitive way to play. It's a port of the 3DS version as the extra mode and levels are included, and I don't get why people online have been throwing a fit about it. People keep saying the graphics are bad, and yeah, I guess it doesn't look that much better compared to the originals, but also, this is just a port. It's not a remake or remaster. It's been marketed as a port and shouldn't have any higher expectations than that, so I found this to be a fun-a-ton to play regardless. They also updated DK's idle pose, so he's playing with a Switch now. That's kinda cool. The only gripe I really have with DKC Returns HD isn't an issue with just the game, it's a company-wide problem. The original developers were not credited in the credits. This is really disappointing to see, but this has been a habit in Nintendo games for years. Even Nintendo Music doesn't credit the original artist, which is really unfair and unprofessional. professional. I really hope that this is resolved eventually, but I can't really judge a game based on what's missing from the credits. This is still worth playing if you enjoy DK games at all. It's one of the best out there. 2. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Imagine DKC returns, but way better in every way. Now, I am combining the Wii U version with the Switch one since there's not enough differences between the two, but wow. It is genuinely amazing how incredible Tropical Freeze is. It's one of the best 2D platformers that I've ever played. The structure is pretty much the same as Returns, but has been updated in a lot of ways. First off, the worlds are amazing. Each level feels so full of life and properly realized. Just look at Returns and Tropical Freeze side by side. You can immediately tell how much more polished the second game is. You can also add Dixie and Cranky Kong as partners, which is awesome, but they're still not playable technically. Each character has unique moves. Diddy still has his little glide, Dixie has this hair twirl that gives you a boost of height, and Cranky can bounce off anything with his cane. While all the characters are helpful, I'm mostly stuck with Dixie since that little extra height boost made avoiding enemies and clearing big jumps a lot easier. The most broken character, however, is the man, the myth, the legend, Funky Kong. He literally has every ability from all the Kongs, and it's hilarious to watch him fly around on his surfboard. Despite using the same art style, the visuals have had a dramatic improvement as you can clearly see more details like DK's fur blowing through the wind in cutscenes. In terms of the normal movement, the only difference is you no longer have that blow attack, which I'm honestly okay with as it slowed things down. Instead, you have a screen nuke when you're with a partner. I didn't really use it, but it's still a nice addition. I also noticed that DK's slapping seems to sound more like a bongo now. Maybe it was like that in Returns as well, but it was really accentuated in this game. Speaking of sound though, the music is simply incredible. It includes some remixes, but also lots of original compositions that weave into each stage perfectly. There's so many different moods captured so seamlessly. The soundtrack really knocked it out of the park. And I haven't even brought up the levels yet. This is the best part. This is one of those rare games where you'll play a level and you get to the end and you'll say to yourself, wow, that was a really cool one. Except that for this game, you're gonna say that over and over and over and over again. The level design is so creative and well executed that I almost can't believe it sometimes. 1 minute you're popping a balloon to launch yourself into the air. Next you're launched from a minecart to a piece of wood, only for it to be transformed into a minecart again. You'll jump across massive leaves falling off the trees, to a buzzsaw throwing pieces of rail at your feet, to climbing an icy mountain while it falls apart in front of you. While I really hope that the next DK game is in 3D and manages to expand on Donkey Kong 64 in a better way, I also wouldn't be that upset if it's another 2D title. Despite preferring the controls of a Mario game, this is Donkey Kong platforming at its absolute finest. Even the bosses were a bit better too. All of them have more interesting patterns to learn and were fun to take on. This is a game that I feel like most people don't remember, but goddamn, it sure is a treasure. 1. Diddy Kong Racing. This one is up there for me. And when I say up there, I mean like a top 10 video game of all time. Mario Kart 64 can be a professional dust collector for all I care. Diddy Kong Racing is one of the most heartwarming and feel-good games of all time. While Donkey Kong technically isn't in it, it does have Diddy and a couple other rare characters at the time like Banjo and Conker. This is not an average kart racer either. It is leaps and bounds above that. First off, you can drive in a plane and a hovercraft. Some tracks only allow one of each vehicle, while some have multiple. Not only is it a really innovative concept, but it actually works really well. Switching between all three vehicles keeps things fresh as they all feel different, and the tracks are built around this mechanic. Some areas can only be accessed with the plane or the car as an example, so it adds a lot of replay value. But then there's the adventure mode, which is what really makes this game amazing. You drive around inside a hub world, and have to find doors that lead to areas that include the racetracks. Each track requires first place, and there's also a silver coin challenge where you have to find all the coins while still getting first. I also love how the doors to the tracks are massive. It adds this extra sense of importance and significance to what you're doing. Taj is also there in the hub world, letting you unlock the vehicles and just being a really chill elephant. Each track is a blast to play on, and has some of the catchiest and happiest music of all time. If you ever need to cheer yourself up on a bad day, just fire up the Diddy Kong Racing OST. It'll help, I promise. Ancient Link is perfect for setting the tone, with its energetic and uplifting beat, making you feel welcome. Everfrost Peak captures not just the essence of Christmas, but winter overall. The feeling of watching snow peacefully fall to the ground, going outside with friends and having an all-day snowball fight. That's the energy that it exudes. Crescent Island is more on the adventurous side. It creates a sense of exciting discovery and that you're on the right path. Again, it just makes you feel good. Greenwood Village has a bit more of a mystic tone, yet curious as the track is constantly changing with its environment. So yeah, I think I've made my point. Diddy Kong Racing's music is half the DNA of the entire game. And to think that I've barely talked about the controls. While they may feel a tad outdated at first, they're easy to get used to. There's also this hilarious mechanic where if you let go of acceleration a bit before hitting a boost, you get this extra large boost of speed and can absolutely clean up races. You don't have to do this, and it's really only helpful if you become familiar with the tracks, but it adds so much exhilaration. And on top of all that, there's even a battle mode. Each level is a little different. There's one where you have to bring eggs to your base, or simply take out enemies with weapons. And there's items, of course, and while they aren't as zany as Mario Karts, they do have a really cool upgrade system. By hitting the same colored balloon, you can upgrade your item 2 extra times. A lot of these upgrades aren't that helpful, but I do like the lock-on missiles quite a bit. There's even boss fights, and this was before Mario Kart DS. You race a Triceratops, Walrus, Octopus, Dragon, and the Whiz Pig himself. All of these are just races to get first place in, but these huge animals are powerful and fast, and they have so much personality and are such a blast to get good at. I could talk about this game for hours, and it is criminal that we haven't gotten another racing game like this. The closest one I can think of is the Crash Team Racing remake on PS4, and that's a remake of the PS1 game, which is the same concept as Diddy Kong Racing. Regardless, if we ever get a new racing title similar to this, I will always love and cherish this game. Donkey Kong has had a pretty wild history over the past 40 years, and while I didn't find that many of the games to be great, the standouts are some of the best of all time. I'm very curious to see where this franchise will be going in the future, and with that, thanks for watching.